emotional response. But here's where I'm going to start messing with the people, because I'm going to go to the second soundtrack on my list now. And we're going to take a total departure into a film that probably most of you have never heard of. When the Monkees, yes, I said that right, Peter Tork, Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, and Michael Nesmith.
The Monkees.
Exactly. The Prefab Four. When their show wrapped up filming, they did an experimental film that was sort of their version of A Hard Day's Night. This movie was actually written and produced by Jack Nicholson. I had a mistake and thought it was directed by Jack Nicholson. It was not. And Nicholson and Dennis Hopper both have small cameos in it, no less. So here you have, music that was actually being written by different some different composers, and some by Mike Nesmith and some by Peter Tork, who were the original two musicians in the band. Fascinating story how they arrived there. They had guys writing their songs. One of them you might have heard of. His name is Neil Diamond. Okay. All their number one hits were written out by some pretty heavy hitters in the music industry, right? A famous story where they wanted out of that contract that said that they had to play these songs, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing an interview with some of them saying, literally, I'd written 8 number one hits for these guys, and they were telling me to go fuck myself. Mike Nesmith has a famous story where he says he held up the contract and he punched it, his fist through it and through the wall in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, which was a really nice hotel and probably still is, trying to say, hey, we don't care about you anymore. And to be honest, most of their own music writing really didn't stand up that well by comparison, as far as being the top hits. Right. But that's where this soundtrack actually kind of stands out. There are some pretty solid songs on this, but it's completely different. It's out of the mold of what kids thought. It was more probably, if they'd been performing this music, they would have fit in a lot better having Jimi Hendrix open for them. Still one of my favorite Monkees facts of all times. When they were doing all of the easy hits that they were famous for on the television show, and that was the reason they were famous, and all those kids showed up and got to see Jimi Hendrix open. Holy shit. I really wish I could meet someone who actually saw that. I still have yet to this day. But it takes, once again, our expectations, our emotions, and it turns it on its head. Hey, see what I did there? Look at that. Amazing segue. God, I'm just too busy patting myself on the back today. I'm killing it. I'm killing it, baby. I'm killing it. Killing it. Experimental filmmaking at its finest. But really, as I say, exploring a new and different side of some people that we knew pretty well, right? It really was not, there wasn't considered a lot of depth there, but it's this one little standout to the side that is honestly and somewhat sadly forgotten. It's really because the film does not follow a typical narrative. It's all over the place. It's very existential. It's kind of Hard Day's Night. It's kind of Help. It's kind of everything rolled into one. But when I'm really picking the top soundtrack, the one I'm going to, it's not even technically named as a soundtrack. It is Queen, A Kind of Magic, which has the distinction of truly being the soundtrack to the movie Highlander. Now, firstly, Queen had done a fair amount of soundtracks. Queen did the soundtrack for Flash Gordon. Let's not forget that. Amazing soundtrack they did. I mean, even a wedding march done with Brian May's guitar. Totally nailing that. But when it comes to emotion, and I still get pumped up for this. I mean, this is a nerdy child's delight, right? Okay, think of the pitch meeting. We're going to have people, and they're immortal unless you cut their heads off. And they're all going to chase each other through time, cutting each other's heads off. Okay, are you with me so far? I mean, it's amazing. This is exactly what
I'm sorry to cut in, but it's not even that hard to believe until you get to the fact that the Spaniard's going to be played by Sean Connery.
No, this is before we even get there.
Levels of coke.
Before we get there, the Scotsman is played by a Frenchman. The Spaniard, who's really Egyptian, is played by the Scotsman. Who everyone thinks is Irish. It's all kinds of crazy, but this song is just hit after hit after hit. The actual title track, A Kind of Magic. Princes of the Universe. I was doing deadlifts the other day, cranking that one up every time. Just gets you ready to go. It is a absolute pump up song. If you've never used it for a sporting event, I absolutely encourage you to do so, as well as the Kurgans, the bad guys theme, Give Me the Prize, you know, and just everyone, they just seem to have so much fun on this album. It's hard for me to find a Queen album. They seem to have always a fair amount of fun, but man, they just seem to just lean into every concept in that. Even the love song, Who Wants to Live Forever, which is, of course, is referencing the film itself and the difficulty of how it would really be if you were truly immortal and watching the people you love grow old and die. They just leaned into every single track, and you absolutely feel it on every one, that they just embrace it, and it still holds up to this day. And that's impressive for a movie with an 80s movie soundtrack, where, as I said, the plot is guys running around for most of recorded history trying to chop each other's heads off.
Time.
Right? Through time. As a small note, and I just have to throw this in here just before my time runs out, that this actually has the title track that I mentioned, A Kind of Magic, never actually makes it onto the Highlander soundtrack, but it makes it onto another 80s classic, and that is Iron Eagle. Yes, a movie that showed us all America can still kick ass. And as a matter of fact, as it's I forget who played the main character of Doug Masters, and it's Louis Gossett Jr. He tells him, you better play the right damn music. And he, somehow has this rig with a 1/4-inch tape player that he rigs up to play music in the cockpit of his F-16. He plays It's a Kind of Magic. As you do, when you two rogue people have stolen multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment and full armament to go take on a rogue Arab nation of undetermined origin. By yourselves, you play Queen, A Kind of Magic, and Louis Gossett Jr. sits there and says, I like it. So how else could you possibly put a soundtrack, in my own personal list above that? I can't. In the end, everything else, I've used the other two to set up my main point, that that movie soundtrack ties it all together for me. Nothing else seems to have as much fun, lean into it, lasts the test of time, even stands well on its own, and supports the film that it's about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I can see him over there getting push-ups, doing his push-ups, getting pumped up, getting ready to take this on, getting ready to spit some fire. Come on, Three of Clubs. What you got for us today?
I don't know, man. This is a lot. This feels like some heavy lifting, well past the deadlifts that you're talking about. Which, full disclosure, I've seen Mr. Fink do this. It is probably as majestic as the songs he's talking about. I mean, we're talking form, we're talking effortless power, effortless.
Wow.
Majestic.
I don't know what I did to get on the Three of Clubs good side today, but I'm going to keep doing it.
I mean, we're talking focus, like an eagle at 10,000 feet, spotting that mouse, high up. The soundtracks is hilarious to me in so many different ways, because in a lot of different ways, it's generational on how we look at it, how we view it, how we accept it, how we anticipate it. There are a couple of times where I felt like soundtracks were very universal in the way that it brought many different perspectives on looking at one, medium, a visual medium, a movie, and kind of changing it. A lot of times we talk about soundtracks as if it was something that was like born out of the 80s or maybe the late 70s, but they go back all the way back to damn near the start of sound in music. It was always a marketing tool. It was always something that people understood. It would move both properties, which in turn would make more money for whoever was the parent companies involved. And sometimes there are weird stories in which these soundtracks come about where they weren't even trying to become soundtracks. They were just really just things that had to happen in the moment. But because of the parent company involved and a lot of times the people having their ownership completely taken away due to these parent companies, then the soundtrack was able to be created, because there's like these house property songs that don't technically exist to anyone until finally the masters are given back. Like Green Onions is probably a great example, is on probably 100 some odd soundtrack. As soon as we all know it, we all hear it. Yeah, it was a fucking B-side from a house group, right? I mean, for a radio station. It's hilarious how these things happen. So at first I was kind of thinking like, when did soundtracks make sense to me, or when it kind of entered my life? And part of it started with my father making sure, almost demanding, that I watch all, I don't want to call it blaxploitation movies. I mean, that's what they are, but it was a little bit more like almost family canon in the house. So like there's all the movies that you sort of had to watch to become sort of a black man, at least in the Smith household. So the soundtracks for those movies always were there, like Shaft, obviously, Black Caesar. I mean, you could keep going. Those are always there, but one that he made sure I watched was The Wiz. And he's like, and the funny part is like, you know, The Wiz because you've listened to it in your entire life. I'm like, yeah, I have, but at the same time, I don't really want to watch the movie. I'm cool with just the soundtrack. But that experience and having my father making sure that was part of my life and that connection sort of honed in my focus towards soundtracks. Now I'm gonna take a step away from that just for a second and kind of go back to the kind of what I was talking in the beginning with the global phenomenon of what soundtracks can do in a very pop culture, powerlistic way of bringing everyone's focus into one thing. And I always go back to, I know who I'm about to say, people are immediately going to say, well, he literally had a movie about his soundtrack, so how come you skip over that? But I always go back to 1989. There's a lot of buzz coming out, new superhero movie coming out. We have to remember what the thought process was coming into 1989. All the superhero movies up until since Superman 2 were shit-tastic. No one was looking forward to any sort of decent superhero movie whatsoever. Like, no one had good expectations, no matter what. We have to remember what it was about. Then all of a sudden, this little kernel of, I won't even call it truth, but this rumor started to come out, which is the soundtracks coming together. And who's on the soundtrack? Well, there's going to be a music video. Who's doing a music video? Who's doing the soundtrack? Then it came out, and the bottom fell the fuck out. People lost their shit. People, I don't give a fuck who you are, from a golf course to the barbershop. Everyone was like, yo, we're watching this shit. We're getting that soundtrack. It is on. We even found out when the fucking video was coming out, almost to the point that was more important than the movie in which it was coming out for. And that was, we all found out Prince was on this motherfucker, and Prince is releasing a video for it. It was over. It was fucking over. We can talk about all the other soundtracks. We can talk about The Bodyguard. We can talk about Titanic. We can talk about all these different movies where soundtracks of broken records. We can talk about Hustle and Flow and that bullshit song that got Grammy, and all the white people like, ooh, this is good rap for us. And we can go on and on. I would love to focus. I only have 10 minutes. Now I only have 5, and I want to focus on things like fucking like Wayne's World. Now we all just skip over the fact of what Wayne's World did to soundtracks in the mid 90s, and how it literally resurrected fucking Queen. Like we want to act like Queen was always going to be at the top and treated the same way it has been in the last 20 years. No, it was fucking Wayne's World that actually brought that shit out. A lot of people want to shit on Bohemian Rhapsody, and I get it, but you can't fucking say that wasn't what actually literally was the AED device to the entity of Queen, which, by the way, thank you for saying Flash Gordon, because I was going to talk about it, but now I have to. But Flash Gordon was one of my first interactions with what a soundtrack can do to a movie and heighten that shit, because anytime I hear Flash, I fucking, it's over. It is on. I'm ready to go. I'm fighting Birdman, people with green blood. I don't give a fuck. Ming could get it. He don't want the smoke when Flash Gordon's playing. He don't want none of that. I'll fuck him up. I'll fuck all of them up. He got a shit ass plan anyway. I mean, literally, you got all this technology, and the best you're gonna do is hurl shit at Earth. Like, what, dude? Your priorities all fucked up. But anyway, bringing it back to the goddamn soundtracks. People found out Prince was involved with Batman, and it was fucking over. And I would argue from that point, soundtracks became a different behemoth. It literally became moments where, in some points, it was the reason to see the movie, the reason to get fired up for the movie. It got you to the point where you didn't even care about the movie, but then you hear about the soundtrack and it's like, all right, yeah, I'll give it a whirl. I'll give it a go. Sometimes